Obviously, during a normal go-around, both the gear and the flaps will be retracted and the thrust will normally be set to a much lower value. And understanding the difference between these two maneuvers, the go-around and the wind shear escape maneuver, will greatly help you understand what's about to happen. So, like I said, it's very likely that the crew discussed this wind shear escape maneuver in detail, since the controller now had warned them about it, and also because it had already been mentioned as a possible threat in the airport brief. The crew were now cleared to continue the descent to flight level 60, and after that they were handed over to the Rostov radar officer, who told them to descend to 600 meters on QFE 990 hectopascals. The first officer incorrectly read back that clearance and said that they were cleared to descend to 800 meters instead, but this was not noticed by the controller, whose English was very poor. Here we can start to see the difference between flying in Russia and in most of the rest of the world. If this QFE pressure setting that the crew just had been given would be selected on the aircraft's altimeters, well, then they would start to show the height over the airport. But the flydubai crews and their aircraft were not equipped to fly their procedures based on QFE, but instead on QNH, which would give them the altitude over sea level instead. Furthermore, the aircraft can only select feet in the mode control panel, so the crew was trained to use conversion tables to convert meters to feet in order to follow the clearances that they were given in Russia. In this case, the crew asked to get the QNH value as well, which was given as 1000 hectopascals, since the airport altitude was about 280 feet over the sea, but the crew missed to actually set this setting and instead selected the QFE of 990 hectopascals by mistake. This error meant that for the entire rest of the descent and approach, the aircraft was actually flying about 280 feet higher than intended. This and the incorrect readback will not have any impact on the outcome of this flight, but it clearly shows how easy mistakes can be made when there's a mix of different units and procedures involved. Anyway, the aircraft continued to descend and was eventually cleared for the ILS approach into runway 22 and also to contact Rostov Tower. The captain asked for flaps 1, followed by flaps 5, and at time 0238, the first officer called the tower controller up and reported that they were descending to 2,600 feet, or 800 meters, and that they were about to capture the localizer. The tower controller welcomed them to the frequency and told them that the current wind was 240 degrees at 11 meters per second, gusting 15, and then cleared them to land runway 22. The crew read this back and soon the localizer was captured and then the glide slope. Everything looked completely normal at this point. Once they were fully established, the missed approach altitude of 2,300 feet was set and then the aircraft started descending down towards the runway. Flaps 10 was then selected, but almost immediately after that, the aircraft entered into an area of moderate turbulence. Initially, the captain kept the autopilot and autothrottle engaged and then proceeded by asking the first officer to select gear down, flaps 15 as well as flaps 25, and then finally flaps 30, which was their planned landing flaps. This meant that as the aircraft descended through about 2,000 feet, it was fully stabilized in the landing configuration. The flaps 30 approach reference speed was 140 knots, and on top of that they would also need to add a correction of minimum 5 and maximum 20 knots to account for the headwind. The way this additive is calculated is by adding half of the steady headwind component plus the full gust value on top. In this case, the steady headwind component was about 20 knots, meaning 10 to add, plus the gust was 8 knots higher than that, so the wind correction should have been 18 knots, but the crew only selected 10. It's hard to know why they did this, but it could have been to increase the margin between the speed they were going to fly, of 150 knots in this case, and the maximum speed for flaps 30, which was 175 knots. Anyway, the aircraft continued to descend, and as they passed 1,850 feet, the captain decided to disconnect the autopilot and autothrottle after first having called it out to the first officer. Now, the automatics had been flying the approach well up until this point, but it's pretty common for pilots to disconnect early during gusty and turbulent conditions just to get a better feel for how the aircraft behaves in order to prepare for landing. In this case, the captain was also using his head-up display, and with the help of that, he was able to track the ILS very closely. The HUD gives flight director guidance through the help of a guidance cue, which is basically a round dot that the pilot can put the aircraft symbol over, and if that's done right, any approach or maneuver can be flown extremely accurately. At time 02:41 and 50 seconds, the captain called out that he now had the runway in sight. The aircraft was then at a distance of 7 kilometers away from the runway at an altitude of 1,240 feet, and except for the turbulence, the captain had no issues with controlling the aircraft and continuing the approach. But 12 seconds after they had broken through the clouds, the
"Go around, wind shear ahead"
warning was suddenly triggered, and within a second, the first officer called out "wind shear," to which the captain answered "wind shear, go around." Now, the fact that they reacted so quickly to this warning was a clear sign that they were prepared for the possibility of this happening. Like I mentioned earlier, in this case, the crew had the possibility of choosing to either fly a normal go-around or a wind shear escape maneuver, and they clearly chose the latter. The captain now pushed the thrust levers forward into the firewall, which is the mechanical stop, and that caused the engines to roar up to 102% N1 as he simultaneously pushed the TOGA switches. The head-up display now switched over to show the wind shear escape guidance, which included a dashed TOGA pitch target line, as well as a filled green wind shear target cue. The captain started pitching for those, but because of the huge thrust now being created by the undermounted engines, he also had to push significantly forward on his yoke to keep the aircraft's attitude from rising above the guidance. This, how much momentum the engines create when at full thrust, is worth remembering for what will happen later. Now, to put this into context, during a normal go-around when the TOGA buttons are pushed, the outer throttle will drive the thrust to reduced go-around thrust, which is normally around 90% N1. This amount of reduced thrust is calculated to give the aircraft a rate of climb of between 1,000 to 2,000 feet per minute, which would result in a nice soft go-around. If full go-around thrust would be needed after that, the pilots could either push the TOGA buttons a second time or place the thrust levers fully forward manually, like these pilots were now doing. That would naturally lead to a much steeper go-around and much more pitch momentum being created by the engines. But since this was a wind shear escape maneuver, the gear was not being retracted and the flaps were still at landing flaps, meaning that the full thrust would not create a super high climb rate. So in this scenario, where the captain started the escape maneuver only about 1,300 feet below the go-around altitude, the aircraft would have been climbing with a vertical speed he was pretty used to seeing, but the thrust lever movements required in order to control the aircraft would have been much larger than in normal circumstances, and that will come with a requirement to trim. Since no configuration changes were to be made during the escape maneuver, the first officer concentrated on checking that all items had been done correctly, and then he decided to call up Rostov Tower to let them know about the missed approach procedure. He did so almost immediately after the maneuver had started, and at the same time as the aircraft's flight director logic went from a go-around maneuver into the altitude acquire mode to give guidance for the aircraft to start leveling off. This call to ATC was not a great idea, since we pilots always have to follow the guiding principle of aviate, navigate and then communicate, and at that moment there was still a lot of aviate left to do. As the captain now started pitching down to level off following the head-up display guidance, he didn't reduce the thrust fast enough, likely because of that huge movement needed, and this meant that the speed started rising quickly. The first officer called out, "Check the speed," and the captain responded, "Speed checked," and at the same time he also realized that he was still pitching up way too much. This caused him to press his stabilizer trim switches forward to try and help reduce the pitch. He held these switches forward for around 4 seconds, which is actually quite a lot, especially since the reduction of thrust would soon mean a need for pitch up trim instead. Now, here it's probably worth talking a little bit about the way that trim is supposed to be used in these type of aircraft. The electric trim can be activated in a few different ways, but in manual flight it is done by pressing the 2 trim switches on the pilot's control yoke in whatever direction that the trim is needed. This will cause the trim wheels in the cockpit to start moving and to change the angle of the horizontal stabilizer in the back of the aircraft to help reduce the need of elevator deflection and therefore reduce the amount of forward or back pressure the pilot needs to input. The idea is that you first use the yoke to set the attitude that you need and then trim the aircraft so that the yoke can be returned to a neutral position. This means that you should never fly with the trim, as there's always a slight delay to the effect of it.